Black voters are stopped at the entrance to the polling station, creating more and more obstacles to deny them the right to vote in the presidential election. But they don't give up. What the voters manage to uncover shocks everyone and draws national attention across the country. Subscribe to find out how their fight for justice ends, and share this video to support everyone's right to vote. Marcus tugged at the sleeves of his worn coat, gazing out of the window of his small apartment. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet street below, where the anticipation of Election Day hummed through the community. The day had finally arrived. This was his chance, their chance, to make a change that had been long overdue. For too many years, Marcus's neighborhood had been ignored, left to struggle without the basic amenities other districts took for granted. They called it a high crime zone and underdeveloped area, but Marcus knew it as home, and like everyone else here, he believed that maybe, just maybe, this vote could be the first step toward a better future. As a veteran, Marcus held a deep respect for the right to vote. He had fought for the values of freedom and equality, though sometimes he felt like those values weren't fully extended to him and others in his community. Still, his heart swelled with pride at the idea of exercising his right as a citizen. He had seen how his people had endured struggles, decades of injustice, discrimination, systemic neglect. But today, he felt hopeful. Today, he would stand with his community to vote for a candidate who promised change and equality, someone who understood their struggles and pledged to address them. Marcus took a deep breath and turned toward the small framed photo on his mantelpiece. It was an image of his father, a man who had marched for civil rights in the 1960s. "This one's for you, Dad," Marcus murmured, a small smile on his face. This vote felt like a tribute, a way to honor the sacrifices his father and so many others had made. Stepping outside, Marcus noticed the buzz of Election Day had swept over the neighborhood. His neighbors were out in groups, chatting about the candidates and discussing their hopes for what this election could bring. Friends, families, elders, and young people alike were united in their purpose. He waved at Miss Jackson, the elderly woman who lived down the hall from him. She was one of the most respected voices in the neighborhood, known for her wisdom and memories of hard-won battles for civil rights. "Mornin', Miss Jackson," he greeted her warmly as she walked up to him. "Mornin', Marcus. Gonna make your voice heard today, right?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with determination. "You bet I am," he replied, nodding firmly. "I'll see you at the polls." They shared a smile before parting ways. It was uplifting to see so many familiar faces, all heading in the same direction, ready to make a difference. As he made his way down the bustling street, Marcus noticed his neighbor and longtime friend Sarah waiting for him by the corner store. Sarah was in her early 70s, with a fiery spirit and a reputation for being outspoken. She had been involved in the community for as long as Marcus could remember, organizing local events, protesting injustices, and rallying people to stand up for their rights. "Ready for this, Marcus?" Sarah called out, her voice brimming with excitement. "More than ready," Marcus replied. They shared a quick hug before heading down the street together, talking about their plans for the day. For Sarah, this election held a special significance. Her husband, a fellow activist, had been denied the right to vote years ago due to a signature mismatch issue. It was an absurd technicality, yet it had cost him his chance to make a difference. Ever since then, Sarah had been wary of potential obstacles at the polling stations. "You know, Marcus, they've done this before," she said with a sigh, shaking her head as they walked. "They find little ways to keep us from voting, Last time they claimed that people had the wrong kind of ID, or that their signatures didn't match. Marcus frowned, a hint of concern shadowing his hopeful expression. You think they'll try something like that again? Wouldn't surprise me, Sarah replied, but we're not going to let it happen this time. Their conversation turned to the neighborhood's recent struggles, the lack of resources, inadequate infrastructure, and schools that were underfunded. The promised repairs and renovations never seemed to reach them. It was as though their district didn't matter to those in power. Today, however, they hoped their votes would bring attention to these issues, making it impossible for officials to ignore them any longer. By the time they reached the polling station, a large crowd had already gathered outside. The line stretched around the block, filled with people who, like Marcus and Sarah, were determined to make their voices heard. A few of the younger residents had brought lawn chairs, ready to settle in for what looked like a long wait. Marcus glanced at Sarah with a mixture of determination and anxiety. "Well, let's do this," he said, joining the line. As they waited, Marcus couldn't help but notice a strange energy among the crowd. Conversations grew tense as people shared stories of past encounters with bureaucracy on Election Day, the long lines, missing names, and errors that seemed to target their community disproportionately. Even now, some people were nervously discussing rumors that the station might be running low on ballots. Marcus tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the unease continued to gnaw at him. About an hour later, a man walked down the line, clipboard in hand, calling out names and checking IDs. When he reached Marcus and Sarah, he took one look at their documents and frowned. "I'm going to need a secondary ID from both of you," the man said in a monotone voice. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but firm. "I've voted here for decades, and I've never needed a secondary ID." "Why now?" The man shrugged, unfazed. "It's just protocol, extra security measures this year." Marcus felt a knot of frustration tighten in his stomach. He pulled out a utility bill as a secondary proof of address, while Sarah reluctantly produced her Medicare card. The man inspected their documents meticulously before marking something on his clipboard and moving down the line. "What was that about?" Marcus muttered as the man disappeared into the crowd. "Just another way to slow us down," Sarah replied, her tone laced with bitterness. "They're testing our patience, hoping some of us will give up and go home." Marcus clenched his fists, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose his temper, not today. The line inched forward, but progress was agonizingly slow. After another hour, they finally reached the entrance of the polling station. Inside, the scene was just as chaotic. Several voters were arguing with the staff about their names missing from the registration list, while others were told that their IDs were insufficient for various arbitrary reasons. The air was thick with tension and frustration. As Marcus and Sarah approached the registration desk, the clerk looked at them with a blank expression, then flipped through the pages of the voter list. "Name?" the clerk asked, not looking up. "Marcus Smith," he replied, his voice steady. The clerk scanned the list, her brow furrowing. "I don't see your name here." "What?" Marcus leaned forward, disbelief spreading across his face. "I registered months ago. I've been voting at this location for years." The clerk offered a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, but you're not on the list. You can fill out a provisional ballot, but I can't guarantee it will be counted." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her own frustration visible. "It's the same nonsense every time," she murmured. "They're trying to silence us." Determined not to back down, Marcus filled out the provisional ballot, though the sense of helplessness gnawed at him. Around them, other voters faced similar issues. People were growing restless, some shouting in frustration, while others left in despair. As Marcus handed in his provisional ballot, he looked around the crowded polling station, a sense of betrayal weighing heavily on him. He had believed in the system, believed that his vote mattered. But today, he felt like a pawn in a rigged game. All his hopes for change, his faith in the power of democracy, now felt like fragile illusions. "Let's go, Marcus," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with quiet anger. "This isn't over yet. We'll keep fighting." They walked out of the station together, their resolve strengthened by the shared indignation. Marcus glanced back at the building, a silent vow forming in his mind. They would not be silenced. Marcus and Sarah left the polling station in a heavy silence. The early morning sun had shifted to a high noon glare, illuminating the long line still snaking around the building. More people had arrived since Marcus and Sarah's initial attempt, each one hopeful, determined, and yet slightly tense as they waited their turn. Even the air felt charged with expectation and an underlying current of unease. They lingered at the edge of the sidewalk, scanning the line and noticing familiar faces. People they knew, neighbors, friends, parents from the local school, and elderly residents from the senior center, all waiting patiently. But as Marcus watched, he couldn't shake the memory of that clerk's dismissive tone and the blatant refusal to acknowledge his right to vote. "They're making it harder on purpose," Sarah muttered, echoing his thoughts. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression somber. "It's not just today, it's every time. This is just the first time I'm really seeing it happen so openly." A group of young men stood a few places behind them, talking among themselves in low, frustrated voices. Marcus caught snippets of their conversation, stories of missing names, endless ID checks, and demands for secondary documents. One of the men noticed Marcus looking and gave him a nod. "You tried voting yet?" the man asked, his voice a mixture of weariness and irritation. Marcus nodded, deciding to share the truth. "They said my name wasn't on the list. Offered me a provisional ballot, but it's just a way of pretending they're letting me vote." The young man rolled his eyes. "Yeah, they told me the same. My brother tried voting at a different station and they turned him away because he didn't bring a bill or something stupid. It's like they're just making up reasons." Sarah shook her head, her eyes narrowed in frustration. "They want us to give up and go home. That's the game." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd around them. People were beginning to realize they weren't alone in this experience. It wasn't just isolated incidents, but a systematic attempt to complicate, obstruct, and deny their right to vote. As the minutes passed, Marcus and Sarah remained outside the polling station, exchanging stories with other voters. The line barely moved, and several people had already given up and left, shaking their heads in frustration. A few were older residents who couldn't afford to stand in line for hours due to health concerns or physical limitations. Others were young parents with restless children who had no choice but to leave. Marcus's frustration grew, fueled by each new story. There was a pattern, clear and undeniable, emerging right before their eyes. He clenched his fists, the familiar surge of anger bubbling up within him. It was one thing to face obstacles in daily life, but to be denied a fundamental right, the right to shape their own futures, was intolerable. A few moments later, a middle-aged woman, visibly agitated, stepped out of the line and approached them. She held up her ID, shaking it in disbelief. "They said my signature doesn't match the one on file," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I've been signing my name the same way for years, and suddenly it's incorrect. They want me to redo it, or they won't let me vote." Her words struck a nerve with Marcus. The lengths the staff was going to in order to disqualify voters were becoming more outrageous. He exchanged a look with Sarah, who was now filming the woman's story on her phone. "This is deliberate," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "They're counting on us to give up, to get frustrated and leave." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "Well, we're not giving up. They're going to hear us, whether they want to or not." They spent the next hour gathering testimonies from other people in line. One woman shared that she'd been told she needed an additional form of ID, something she had never needed in previous elections. Another man had been asked to prove his residency, despite having registered in this district over a decade ago. Story after story poured forth, each one revealing yet another way in which their votes were being suppressed. At that moment, Marcus noticed a woman with a clipboard approaching the line. She wore a bright red jacket and held a pen poised over the paper, her expression one of grim focus. She scanned the line, pausing now and then to jot something down. When she reached Marcus and Sarah, she stopped. "Excuse me," she said in a formal tone. "I'm conducting random spot checks today. May I see your ID?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his suspicion evident. "Random spot checks? We've already been checked once." The woman didn't waver. "Yes, but we're taking extra precautions this year. It's for everyone's safety." Marcus sensed the absurdity in her statement. He reluctantly handed her his ID, watching her scrutinize it before jotting down his name on her clipboard. Beside him, Sarah crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "They're just finding ways to drag this out." As the woman walked away, Marcus felt a wave of exhaustion settle over him. The line stretched on, the hours passed, and yet it seemed they were no closer to reaching the voting booth than when they had first arrived. Around him, he could see other people growing restless, their faces marked by frustration, fatigue, and a dawning realization that they might not get to vote at all. Somewhere near the back of the line, a group of young voters began chanting, their voices ringing out across the street. "Let us vote! Let us vote!" The chant grew louder, others joining in until it reverberated through the crowd. Marcus felt a swell of pride, but it was tinged with bitterness. Why should they have to fight so hard just to exercise their rights? Just as the chant reached its peak, a polling station official stepped outside and raised a hand for silence. The crowd quieted, though their expressions remained defiant. "We're experiencing some technical issues," the official announced. "There may be a delay in processing ballots. We ask for your patience as we work to resolve the problem." Marcus's jaw clenched. He'd heard enough. Taking a step forward, he raised his voice to address the official. "We've been waiting here for hours," he called out. "You're making it impossible for us to vote. This isn't a technical issue. It's a suppression tactic." Several people murmured in agreement, their voices underscoring his words. The official shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "We're doing our best to accommodate everyone," he replied, his tone unconvincing. "If you're unable to wait, you're welcome to return later." Marcus's heart sank at the thinly veiled message. Returning later was not an option for most of them. They had jobs, families, responsibilities. Yet here they were, fighting tooth and nail to make their voices heard, only to be told to wait. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes flashing with determination. "We're not leaving, and if we have to wait, we'll wait together. But don't think for a second that we're going to let you get away with this." The official, visibly uncomfortable, mumbled something unintelligible and disappeared back into the building. The crowd watched him go, a heavy silence settling over them as they absorbed the harsh reality of their situation. Hours dragged by. The line moved sporadically, each inch forward feeling like a hard-won victory. Marcus and Sarah continued talking to those around them, sharing stories, offering encouragement, and keeping spirits up as best they could. But fatigue was beginning to take its toll. When they finally reached the registration desk, Marcus felt a pang of anxiety. He handed over his ID, watching the clerk's face carefully as she scanned the voter list. Her expression remained neutral, but Marcus's heart sank as she looked up. "I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the list," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You'll have to fill out a provisional ballot." It was as if time had stopped. Marcus stared at her, disbelief giving way to a surge of anger. "Not on the list?" he echoed. "I've been registered here for years. I voted here in the last election." The clerk offered a faint smile. "I understand, but unfortunately, if your name isn't on the list, you'll need to use a provisional ballot. It's just a formality." Marcus clenched his fists, struggling to contain his frustration. He glanced at Sarah, who looked equally outraged. They had waited all this time, endured hours of obstacles, only to be told that his vote wouldn't even be counted properly. Taking a deep breath, Marcus filled out the provisional ballot, his hands shaking with suppressed anger. Around him, others were facing the same predicament, their voices rising in protest as they too were told their names weren't on the list. As he handed in the ballot, Marcus felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. He had come here with so much hope, ready to make a difference, only to be met with endless barriers and excuses. It was as though every part of the system was working against him, pushing him down, denying him his rights. Beside him, Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep fighting, Marcus," she said softly. "This isn't over." Marcus nodded, though his heart felt heavy. The chant from earlier echoed in his mind, "Let us vote," but now it felt more like a plea than a demand. He glanced back at the line, at the faces of those who still waited, their resolve unwavering despite the odds. As they walked away from the polling station, Marcus knew one thing for certain: this battle was far from over. And no matter how many obstacles they threw in his way, he would not be silenced. Marcus and Sarah left the polling station in a heavy, uneasy silence. Their experience was becoming all too clear. This wasn't just a random inconvenience. This was an orchestrated effort to keep people like them from voting. As they stood outside the building, absorbing the events of the past few hours, the energy among the crowd was shifting. Frustration and anger simmered beneath the surface, and more people were beginning to question what was really going on. Just then, Marcus noticed a small group gathered nearby, their faces filled with a shared determination. A woman with a deep voice was speaking up, her words striking a chord with those around her. "They're trying to scare us off," she said, her voice strong. "This isn't an accident. They're counting on us to give up, to go home. But we won't let them win." The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions hardening as they recognized the pattern of obstacles they were all facing. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a glance, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let their voices be silenced now. As they rejoined the line, Marcus noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd, all of them wearing the same expressions of anger and disbelief. A young man named Trey, whom Marcus had known since childhood, approached him, shaking his head in frustration. "Man, they told me my address wasn't correct," Trey muttered, his eyes flashing with anger. "I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. How is my address incorrect?" Marcus shook his head, unable to hide his own frustration. "They told me I wasn't on the list at all, just handed me a provisional ballot and said it might get counted." Trey scoffed, looking around at the line of people who were all facing similar issues. "This is a joke. They're just finding excuses to turn us away." Nearby, an elderly man with a cane shook his head in disbelief. "I've been voting here for decades," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Today, they told me I needed a utility bill to prove my residency. A utility bill." As more people shared their stories, the pattern of discrimination became impossible to ignore. Each person had a different story, a different reason why their vote was being questioned or delayed. It was as if the polling station had been specifically instructed to find any possible excuse to deny them their right to vote. Sarah, still filming on her phone, leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "We have to get this out there. People need to see what's really happening." Marcus nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. "They do, and we're not going anywhere until we're heard." An hour passed, then another. The line barely moved, and the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. Tired but undeterred, the crowd grew more vocal, their frustration boiling over as they continued to face obstacle after obstacle. Just then, a polling station worker emerged from the building, his expression tense as he addressed the crowd. "We're experiencing some delays with our equipment," he announced, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "If you'd like to come back later, you're welcome to try again then." A chorus of angry voices erupted in response. "Come back later, after we've been waiting for hours?" one man shouted, his face flushed with anger. "This is just another excuse to get us to leave," a woman called out, her voice filled with fury. The polling worker seemed taken aback, his gaze shifting nervously as he realized the crowd wasn't buying his explanation. He quickly retreated back inside, leaving the crowd even more incensed than before. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is unacceptable. They're denying us our rights, and they think they can just brush us off like we don't matter." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices uniting in a chorus of defiance. "Let us vote! Let us vote!" they chanted, the sound echoing down the street as more people joined in. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he looked around at the faces of his neighbors and friends, all of them standing strong despite the endless obstacles. But his pride was mixed with a deep, simmering anger. He had fought for his country, risked his life to protect its freedoms, and now he was being denied those very rights by the people he had served. As the chant continued, Sarah approached him, her face flushed with determination. "I'm not leaving this line until they let us vote, Marcus. I don't care how long it takes." Marcus nodded, his own resolve solidifying. "Me neither. This is our right, and we're not going to let them take it from us." The crowd continued chanting, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. It was as if they were reclaiming their power, refusing to be silenced by a system that was designed to keep them down. Suddenly, Marcus noticed a group of people approaching from the other side of the street. They were holding signs, their faces filled with determination as they joined the crowd. He recognized a few of them as activists who had been vocal about voting rights in the community. They held signs that read, "Our voices matter," and "Equal voting rights for all." One of the activists, a young woman with a megaphone, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "They're trying to silence us," she shouted, her voice amplified by the megaphone. "They think they can take away our right to vote just because we're from this community, but we're not going to let them." The crowd cheered in response, their energy renewed as they listened to the activists' passionate words. "They've thrown every obstacle in our way. Long lines, extra ID requirements, missing names, broken machines. But we're still here, and we're not leaving until they let us vote." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices blending together in a powerful show of solidarity. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he joined the chant, his voice strong and unwavering. As the evening wore on, more stories began to emerge from the crowd. One man shared that he had been told his ID wasn't sufficient because it didn't match the exact address on his registration. Another woman revealed that she had been asked to provide multiple forms of identification, even though she had already shown her driver's license. The stories were endless, each one more outrageous than the last. It was clear that these weren't isolated incidents. This was a coordinated effort to disenfranchise an entire community. Sarah continued filming, capturing every story, every moment of frustration and determination. She knew that people needed to see this, to understand the lengths to which the system was willing to go to suppress their voices. At one point, Marcus noticed a young man standing near the front of the line, his face filled with despair. He had been waiting for hours, only to be told that there were no more ballots available. "They said they're waiting on a delivery," the young man said, his voice shaking with anger. "How do you run out of ballots on election day?" Marcus shook his head, his heart heavy with frustration. "They're just trying to wear us down, make us give up, but we can't let them win." As the night drew on, the crowd continued to grow, their voices unwavering as they stood together in defiance. More activists arrived, bringing food and water for those who'd been waiting in line all day. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a sense of solidarity binding them together as they fought for their rights. Finally, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a local news crew arrived, their cameras capturing the scene. The reporter approached Marcus and Sarah, her face filled with curiosity as she asked them about their experience. "They've been doing everything they can to keep us from voting," Marcus explained, his voice filled with frustration. "Missing names, Idaho checks, broken machines, you name it, they've used it against us. But we're not giving up." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "They think they can scare us away, make us go home, but we're here to stay. This is our right, and we're not leaving until they let us vote." The reporter nodded, visibly moved by their story. "Thank you for sharing your experience. We'll make sure people hear about what's happening here." As the camera rolled, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his vote anymore. It was about standing up for his community, for his family, for every person who had been denied their rights. As the news crew continued filming, the crowd erupted in a new chant, their voices filling the air with a powerful message of defiance. "No justice, no peace, let us vote." The chant grew louder, echoing down the street as more people joined in. It was a moment of unity, a collective refusal to be silenced. And as Marcus looked around at the faces of his neighbors and friends, he knew one thing for certain. They were in this together, and they would not back down. No matter how many obstacles the system threw at them, they would continue to fight. Because this was their right, their voice, their future. And they were not going to let anyone take that away. Collective outrage and determination to cast their votes. The oppressive air, filled with disbelief and simmering frustration, settled over the crowd as night approached, but the sense of resolve remained. As Marcus looked around, he noticed Sarah still recording on her phone, capturing the faces, the stories, and the mounting anger of people who had been turned away, denied, or subjected to endless obstacles. Each story added fuel to the fire, a growing testament to the systematic suppression they were all enduring. "Sarah, we need to get these videos out there," Marcus said, glancing at the long line stretching down the block. "People need to see what's happening here. They can't ignore us if the whole world is watching." Sarah nodded, her eyes fierce with determination. "I've been posting clips all day. The response is overwhelming. People are starting to take notice. But we need more coverage. They need to see what they're doing to us." She posted another video, this time showing a line of elderly voters who had been standing in line for hours, some leaning on canes, others visibly exhausted. Their resilience, however, was unwavering. They were determined to vote, no matter the barriers in their way. As the videos spread across social media, local activists and allies began to arrive, some carrying signs, others offering bottled water and snacks to those who had been waiting all day. Among them was a familiar face, a local news reporter named Tina Chen, who had built a reputation for covering issues of inequality and justice. Her cameraman sat up beside her as she approached Marcus and Sarah. "I saw the videos online," Tina said, her voice filled with concern. "What's happening here is outrageous. I wanted to come down and get the story firsthand." Marcus felt a surge of hope as he shook Tina's hand. "It's good to see you here. They're trying to keep us from voting, Tina. Every single one of us has faced some kind of obstacle today." Tina nodded, her expression somber. "I've been hearing the stories. Signature mismatches, demands for multiple IDs, missing names on the lists. It's clearly targeted. This is more than just a technical issue or a delay." Sarah, still holding her phone, stepped closer. "We need people to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. This is happening across the district in every polling station with a majority of black voters." Tina turned to her cameraman, signaling him to start recording. She raised her microphone, her voice steady and clear as she began speaking to the camera. "We're here at one of the polling stations in the heart of the city, where voters are facing unprecedented obstacles in exercising their right to vote. From long lines and broken machines to misplaced registrations and unexplained ID requirements, it's clear that these barriers are disproportionately affecting black voters in this community." The crowd watched as Tina's report went live, her words resonating deeply with each person standing there. Some people cheered, others chanted, "Let us vote," in unison. The tension in the air had shifted. They weren't just frustrated. They were empowered by the knowledge that their voices were finally reaching beyond this street corner. As the interview continued, a commotion erupted near the entrance of the polling station. Marcus turned to see a group of officials exiting the building, their faces set with grim expressions. One of them, a man in a dark suit with a clipboard in hand, approached Tina. "Excuse me, but this is a private property," he said, his tone stiff. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Tina looked at him squarely, her expression unwavering. "I'm here as a member of the press, reporting on the conditions at this polling station. The public has a right to know what's happening here." The official bristled, glancing nervously at the camera before responding. "We are doing everything we can to accommodate voters. Any delays are due to technical difficulties, and we ask for your patience." Marcus stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "Technical difficulties? We've been standing here for hours, told to provide extra documents. our names missing from the lists, and now you're saying it's just a technical problem?" The official's gaze hardened. "Sir, we're doing our best to ensure a fair and secure process. If you're unable to comply with the requirements, you're welcome to leave and return later." A murmur of disbelief swept through the crowd. Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the official's words like a slap to the face. These requirements weren't about security or fairness. They were about control, about denying their rights under the guise of protocol. Tina turned the camera back to the crowd, capturing their reactions. "The people here have waited long enough," she said, addressing her audience. "They've endured repeated obstacles, yet they're still standing strong. It's clear that they won't be silenced." With the camera rolling, Sarah turned to address the crowd directly, her voice filled with determination. "We're not leaving until every single one of us has the chance to vote," she declared, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "They want us to give up, to go home, but we're here to stay. They can't deny us our rights." The crowd responded with a chorus of agreement, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "Let us vote! Let us vote!" The chant echoed down the street, an undeniable call for justice. As the evening deepened, Tina's report continued to broadcast live, drawing attention from viewers across the city and beyond. The story spread, and soon enough, other news outlets began picking it up. People all over the country were watching as the residents of this community stood up to the obstacles that had been placed in their way. As the night wore on, more activists and supporters arrived, bringing blankets, chairs, and hot drinks to those who had been waiting in line for hours. The atmosphere was tense but resolute, each person emboldened by the knowledge that their struggle was being seen, that their voices were being amplified. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude as he looked around at the crowd, the neighbors and friends who had come together in the face of injustice. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both pride and frustration. They shouldn't have to fight this hard just to vote, but here they were, standing together, refusing to be silenced. As the line moved forward, inch by inch, Marcus noticed an elderly woman struggling to stand, her face etched with fatigue. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, offering her his arm for support. "Thank you, young man," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I've never seen anything like this. They're trying to break us, but they don't know who they're dealing with." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We're stronger than they think. They can't take this from us." In the early hours of the morning, just as it seemed the line would finally reach the voting booths, another announcement came from the entrance of the building. "We're experiencing a shortage of ballots," an official called out, his voice barely audible over the crowd's groans of frustration. "We're waiting on a delivery, but we don't have an estimated time of arrival." The crowd erupted in anger, their voices blending into a cacophony of disbelief. Marcus felt a surge of fury as he processed the official's words. A shortage of ballots? On election day? It was beyond comprehension. "They're just trying to stall us," Sarah muttered, her voice filled with frustration. "They're hoping we'll get tired and leave." But Marcus's resolve only hardened. He wasn't going anywhere, not until he had cast his vote. And as he looked around at the faces of his neighbors and friends, he knew they felt the same. As the crowd settled back into the line, their faces grim with determination, Sarah continued filming, capturing every moment, every obstacle, every act of resistance. She posted the video online, the footage quickly gaining traction as viewers across the country watched in disbelief. Soon, messages of support began pouring in, with people from all walks of life expressing their solidarity and outrage. The community's struggle had struck a chord, sparking a national conversation about voting rights and the lengths to which people were being forced to go to have their voices heard. At one point, Marcus received a message on his phone from a friend in another state. "We're watching you," the message read. "We're with you." The simple words filled him with a renewed sense of strength. This wasn't just about their community anymore. It was about every community, every person who had ever been denied their rights. As the first light of dawn began to break over the city, a rumble of movement stirred the crowd. The ballot delivery had finally arrived, and with it, the promise of justice. Marcus watched as the officials unloaded boxes of ballots, each one a symbol of the fight they had waged, the battle they had won simply to have their voices counted. One by one, the voters stepped forward, casting their ballots with a sense of triumph. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he handed his ballot to the official, the weight of the past 24 hours lifting from his shoulders. Beside him, Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Marcus nodded, a sense of victory filling his heart. "Yeah, we did. And they're going to hear us, loud and clear." As they walked away from the polling station, the crowd dispersed, each person carrying with them a sense of accomplishment, a knowledge that they had stood up, fought back, and refused to be silenced. But for Marcus and Sarah, this was just the beginning. Their voices had been heard, but the fight for justice was far from over. The morning after their grueling battle at the polling station, Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him, but he couldn't ignore the buzzing on his phone. Messages poured in from friends, family, and even strangers who had seen the news coverage of what had transpired the day before. Photos, videos, and stories from their community had gone viral, igniting a national outcry over voter suppression tactics aimed squarely at communities like theirs. As he scrolled through messages of support and outrage, Marcus felt a mix of pride and anger. Their struggle had captured the nation's attention, but the cost had been steep. His own father had fought for the right to vote decades before, and yet here he was, fighting the same battle in a new guise. That morning, Marcus met Sarah outside the community center, where a crowd had already begun to gather. Activists, journalists, and community members stood together, all ready to confront the issue head-on. Sarah, her face weary but determined, greeted Marcus with a nod. "It's all over the news," she said, holding up her phone to show him a headline. "Voter Suppression Scandal. Community Fights for Their Rights Amidst Systematic Barriers." Beneath the headline was a photo of their crowd from the night before, standing resolute outside the polling station. "It's time people see what we've been dealing with," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "They can't deny what's happening here anymore. We won't let them." Just then, Tina Chen, the local journalist who had been covering their story, approached them, her cameraman at her side. "Marcus, Sarah, thank you for meeting me," Tina said, shaking their hands. "The footage we aired last night struck a nerve. People are outraged, and we're beginning to see other communities speak out about similar issues. You've started something big here." "We're just standing up for our rights," Sarah replied, her eyes fierce. "But if it takes exposing this to the world to make change, we'll keep going." As the crowd gathered in the community center, a few more journalists arrived, joined by local activists who had experience in voter rights cases. Among them was Evelyn Brooks, a renowned civil rights attorney who had taken on high-profile cases in the past. Marcus had heard of her, but he hadn't expected her to take an interest in their struggle. Evelyn took the stage, her voice strong and resonant as she addressed the crowd. What happened here yesterday was not an isolated incident. What you all experienced, the delays, the ID checks, the missing names, it's a pattern we've seen in targeted communities across the country. And it's not just inconvenient. It's a violation of your constitutional rights. The room filled with murmurs of agreement, each person feeling the weight of her words. Evelyn continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We're going to fight this," she declared. "We'll investigate every instance of discrimination, every incident where voters were turned away or denied, and we're taking this case to court. This is about more than just one election. It's about justice for every voter who has ever been denied their voice." Marcus felt a surge of hope as Evelyn's words sank in. For the first time, it felt like there was a real chance for accountability, for change that went beyond empty promises. Later that day, as the investigation unfolded, Marcus and Sarah sat with Evelyn, reviewing evidence gathered from the night before. They went over Sarah's videos, witness statements, and even a few anonymous tips that had come in from inside the polling station. One of the tips was a damning piece of evidence. An internal memo circulated among polling staff instructing them to enforce additional security checks on voters from high-risk districts. It was a thinly veiled code, Marcus realized, for predominantly black and low-income neighborhoods. "This is what we needed," Evelyn said, her expression grim but resolute. "With this, we can prove that these measures weren't about security. They were about targeting specific communities." As they combed through more documents and statements, another pattern emerged. Several polling stations across the state had reported similar tactics: delaying ballots, questioning IDs, losing registration records. The same memo had been circulated in multiple districts, all with a high percentage of minority voters. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Marcus felt a surge of anger as he realized the lengths to which officials had gone to suppress their voices. They weren't just facing localized obstacles. They were up against a systematic campaign designed to silence entire communities. Sarah glanced over at him, her face tight with anger. "They're terrified of us, Marcus. They're scared of what our voices can do if they actually let us use them." With the evidence mounting, Evelyn coordinated with local and national civil rights organizations who rallied to their cause. Word spread quickly, and soon protesters took to the streets in solidarity. Placards reading "Let us vote" and "Our voices matter" filled the air as people marched through the city, chanting and demanding justice. The protests were more than just a show of support. They were a movement that reverberated throughout the country. Communities from other cities joined in, sharing their own stories of voter suppression and discrimination. What had begun as a local struggle was now a national issue, with people across the nation rallying behind Marcus and his community's fight for justice. Meanwhile, the news coverage intensified. The leaked memo was picked up by national news networks, and the details of the voter suppression tactics were laid bare for the country to see. Officials scrambled to control the narrative, insisting that the measures had been taken in the interest of security, but the public wasn't buying it. The scandal was too big to cover up, too blatant to excuse. As the pressure mounted, Marcus received a message from an anonymous source claiming to be an employee within the state's election office. The message contained detailed instructions on where to find additional records that proved top officials had orchestrated the suppression efforts. Following the instructions, Marcus and Sarah, along with Evelyn and her legal team, uncovered a series of emails and documents that linked the voter suppression tactics directly to senior government officials. The documents revealed explicit orders to minimize turnout in unfavorable districts and prioritize resources for districts with a favorable voting base. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to suppress the voices of Black, immigrant, and low-income voters to maintain control. Evelyn's legal team quickly compiled the evidence, filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of the community. It was a historic case, and it sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Politicians who had been complicit in the scheme were publicly named, their actions laid bare for the world to see. The court proceedings began, drawing intense media coverage and public attention. Marcus and Sarah sat in the courtroom alongside their neighbors, watching as witness after witness testified about the injustices they had faced. The polling officials tried to defend their actions, citing security protocols and administrative oversights, but the leaked documents and testimonies painted a different picture. Evelyn presented the leaked memo and internal emails as evidence, showing the court how officials had explicitly targeted communities like Marcus's to suppress their votes. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge's expression grew grimmer with each new piece of information. At one point, Marcus himself was called to the stand. He spoke from the heart, describing the experience of standing in line for hours, facing one obstacle after another, all to exercise a right he had thought was protected. He shared stories from his community, the elderly neighbors who had been turned away, the young voters who had been forced to leave in frustration. "We're not asking for special treatment," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We're asking for the same rights that everyone else has, to vote without fear, without obstacles, without being treated like we don't matter." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the audience. Marcus felt a surge of pride and purpose as he looked out over the courtroom, seeing his neighbors standing with him. As the trial concluded, the judge ruled in favor of Marcus's community, condemning the voter suppression tactics and calling for immediate reforms. The ruling was a victory not only for them, but for communities across the nation. It was a message that their voices could not be silenced, that their rights were worth fighting for. News of the verdict spread quickly, and celebrations erupted in Marcus's neighborhood. People cheered, hugged, and sang songs of triumph, their joy echoing through the streets. They had won, not just for themselves, but for future generations who would no longer face the same barriers. As Marcus stood amid the celebration, he felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing they had made a difference. Beside him, Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "They tried to take our voices, but we showed them just how powerful we are," she said. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the struggle lift from his shoulders. They had fought, they had endured, and they had won. And now, as he looked at the faces around him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The ruling in favor of Marcus and his community sent shockwaves across the nation. Headlines blared, "Voter suppression tactics exposed," "Community wins historic victory for voting rights," and "Justice served for disenfranchised voters." News anchors discussed the case, highlighting the relentless efforts of Marcus, Sarah, and their neighbors who had stood up against a system bent on silencing them. Their fight was no longer a local story. It was a movement that had shaken the very foundations of the electoral system. The energy in Marcus's neighborhood was electric. People were gathering at the community center, the streets buzzing with laughter and celebration. Marcus stood in the middle of it all, watching as neighbors, friends, and strangers alike embraced, their faces bright with the triumph of a hard-won victory. It felt surreal. All the anger, frustration, and despair they had felt during those long hours at the polling station had transformed into something beautiful, a sense of pride, accomplishment, and empowerment. As Sarah approached him, she held up her phone, showing him a live stream of the celebration. People across the country were tuning in, sending messages of congratulations and solidarity. Their victory had inspired countless others, and communities from all over were reaching out, sharing stories of similar struggles, thanking them for fighting back. "We did it, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice filled with joy. "We actually did it." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "This is for everyone who came before us and everyone who'll come after. They tried to keep us down, but we rose up together." Later that evening, Marcus attended a small gathering at the community center where Evelyn, their civil rights attorney, had been invited to speak. The crowd quieted as she took the stage, her voice carrying a powerful message. This victory is about more than just one community. It's a message to every person who has ever been denied their rights, every person who has ever felt that their voice didn't matter, Evelyn said, her words resonating with each person in the room. "You have shown the world that we will not be silenced, that we will stand up and fight for our rights. This is just the beginning." Applause filled the room, and Evelyn looked at Marcus and Sarah, a warm smile spreading across her face. Marcus, Sarah, and everyone who stood in line, who faced down obstacles, who refused to back down, this victory belongs to you. You have not only defended your own rights, but have paved the way for others to do the same. Your courage has changed things for the better. As Evelyn stepped down from the stage, Marcus felt the full weight of her words. Their struggle had indeed created ripples of change, reaching far beyond the bounds of their neighborhood. In the days that followed, Marcus and Sarah became unlikely heroes, receiving messages and letters from people they had never met. They were invited to speak at events, to share their story with other communities, to encourage people to stand up for their rights. They traveled to cities where similar battles were being fought, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had also endured injustice. But as they embraced their newfound roles, they never lost sight of the people in their own community. The elderly neighbors who had waited in line with them, the young activists who had brought water and blankets, the families who had watched anxiously from home. Their fight had always been about these people, about the place they called home. One afternoon, as they prepared to attend another event, Sarah turned to Marcus, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "You know, Marcus," she said, "it's funny. When we started this, I never imagined it would get this big. We were just trying to make sure we could vote." Marcus chuckled, nodding in agreement. "I know, but I think that's the power of our voices. They tried to silence us, and we ended up being louder than ever." Sarah smiled, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. "This is what my husband would have wanted. He always said that our voices are our strongest weapon." They shared a moment of silence, both thinking of the many people who had fought for their rights before them. This victory felt like a tribute, a continuation of a struggle that had spanned generations. Months passed, and reforms began to take shape across the country. In the wake of Marcus's case, legislators introduced new laws aimed at protecting voting rights and preventing the kinds of suppression tactics that had plagued their community. These reforms mandated transparent practices at polling stations, standardized ID requirements, and ensured that all voters, regardless of their background, had equal access to their voting rights. The case set a precedent, becoming a cornerstone in the fight for civil rights. It was studied by legal scholars, cited in courtrooms, and used as a foundation for advocacy across the country. Marcus's story, and the story of his community, had become a symbol of resilience and justice. But, despite the changes, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. He had seen firsthand how deeply rooted these issues were, how easily rights could be eroded if left unprotected. He resolved to continue advocating, to remain vigilant, to ensure that the progress they had made would not be undone. One day, as Marcus was leaving the community center, he noticed a young girl standing by the door, watching him with wide eyes. She couldn't have been more than 12, but there was a look of admiration in her gaze that made him pause. "Are you Marcus?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled, nodding. "Yes, I am." The girl's eyes lit up, and she stepped forward, her expression earnest. "I saw you on the news. You helped us win. You made sure we could all vote." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at her, seeing the future in her young, hopeful face. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze. "We all did it together," he said softly. "And it's not just for us. It's for you too, so that you'll never have to face the same barriers we did." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "When I'm old enough, I'll vote too, and I'll make sure everyone else can too." Marcus felt a surge of pride and hope. This, he realized, was what they had fought for, not just for the present, but for the future, for the next generation, for the children who would grow up knowing that their voices mattered. As he walked home that evening, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had faced down the system, demanded their rights, and won a victory that would echo for years to come. And while he knew there would always be battles to fight, he felt ready to face them. In the end, he had learned that the true power of their voices lay not in their volume, but in their resilience, their unity, and their unwavering commitment to justice. The road ahead would not be easy, but they were prepared. For Marcus, Sarah, and their community, this was not an end. It was the beginning of a journey toward a fairer, more just world. And with each step they took, they carried the strength of those who had come before them, and the hope of those who would come after. They had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their voices could never be silenced. Thank you for watching to the end. If you were touched by this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos that dive into our most important and relevant topics. Move on to the next video or check out our playlist for even more inspiring stories. Share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can tell the world what really matters. Support us so that every story resonates and makes you think.